Hello, friends. So today what we're talking about is we're talking about the selections from Patricia Churchland's books Neurophilosophy and Touching a Nerve. So Churchland, just to give you a little background, so Patricia Churchland is a philosopher at the University of California at San Diego. She's there with her husband, Paul Churchland, and they're both philosophers who do work with neuroscience. So Patricia Churchland actually wrote her book Neurophilosophy, which you read a small chunk of. Founded a subdiscipline within philosophy of mind called neurophilosophy. And what neurophilosophy tries to do is address philosophical issues using the neuroscience, using neuroscientific data. So that's an important point to remember, and we're going to come back to it at the end of this lecture. So anyway, I'll leave it at that for right now. So the two pieces you read one from neurophilosophy, the other from Touching a Nerve. So what I want to do is I want to first talk about the piece from neurophilosophy and then talk about the second one. Because what the first one does is it takes direct aim at Descartes' view of mind, right? It directly, it sort of argues against Cartesian dualism, right, or substance dualism. And what the second piece offers us is a little glimpse into how to think about mind if you can't, talk about mind. So, let's do this. So, neurophilosophy. So, Churchland first considers reasons to be a dualist, right? And she says, we've got Descartes' arguments. We also have Frank Jackson, right? His arguments with qualia. In fact, if you remember the colorblind neuroscientist, or rather not colorblind, but rather the Mary the neuroscientist in the black and white lab. That was an argument about qualia, right? To show that if you know all of the facts about how the visual system works, and you know all of the relevant physical facts, even then you don't know all of the facts about perception, right? Because there are these facts about what it's like to see an object, right, or to experience an object for the first time, right? That aren't captured by the physical facts. And then Churchland also offers a few other reasons to be a dualist, right? So she says, in light of these arguments, why should we dump dualism? And for her, it comes down to a problem that was actually first brought up by Princess Christina. I'm pretty sure Princess Christina in her in a mail exchange or a letter exchange that she had with Descartes. And it's what's come to be known as the problem of interaction. So there are two ways to think about it, right? There's a sort of a simple, intuitive way, and then there's a slightly more difficult, nuanced way, right? So let's do the intuitive way first. So the problem of interaction is this. You have two substances, right? You have mental substance, and you have physical substance. So the question is, how on earth do two different kinds of substances interact, right? Because by definition, mental substance is outside of space and time, right? I mean, Descartes makes this very clear that mental substance is not physical substance, right? It doesn't have a location in space, doesn't have a location in time. But bodies do have locations in space and time, right? I am here now, right? Or my body is here now. So how on earth can something that exists outside of time, in space, causally interact with something inside time and space, right? To really get at the force of this problem, imagine trying to hammer a physical nail with a non-physical hammer. Right? So the question is, how the hell does that work? And then, of course, the insinuation here is that, it can't work, right? It's not going to work. So that's the intuitive version of the problem of interaction, right? That it's insurmountably difficult to explain how non-physical substance can interact with physical substance. Here's the slightly more technical version. So we know, right? We know thanks to physics that energy is conserved, right? Energy in the universe, matter and energy in the universe are neither created nor destroyed. It's just sort of shifted around. So what that means is that all of our physical activities, right, things from like gesturing, things to like walking across the room, things like taking a sip of water, all of these activities can be explained by appeal to physical forces. So what happens when you throw in a non-physical substance? What happens when you throw a non-physical substance into the mix? Well, here's what you get. This action, taking a sip of water, that action is completely and totally explained by the laws of physics, right, by physical events. When you throw in mental substance and mental forces, you're adding energy into the system. What sort of energy are you adding? Well, you're adding this new non-physical energy, whatever the hell that might be, right? Just granted it exists, notice that you have to add this into the system, right? And so what we end up with is we end up with a picture in which we're violating the basic laws of physics. Energy isn't conserved, rather energy is added into a system, right? Because for me to do this, everything needed for me to do that is physical. If you add to that story that there's non-physical energy, right, that there's mental energy or a mental substance making that happen, well then you're no longer obeying basic laws about conservation of energy, right, because you're now adding energy into the system. You're adding mental energy where it wasn't needed and where it wasn't accounted for by the basic laws of physics. So the problem of interaction on this view is that mental energy, or rather mental substance, violates basic principles of thermodynamics. So what does this mean for us? Does it mean that we can't be dualists? Well, not exactly, right? So we have this great big problem that dualism doesn't fit with what we know from the sciences, right? So one thing you can do is you can say, well, I'm really not all that committed to the sciences. Thermodynamics, yeah, I hope it works out. I hope it tells a really nice and neat story. But I'm not all that committed to it. I'm more committed to being a dualist. So you could be a dualist, right? You could endorse the existence of a separate soul and just say that physics has to conform itself to this, somehow has to take this into account. So far it hasn't, but physics needs to do that in the future. That's one way to go about doing things. Another way to go about doing things is to say that mental, physical, causal interactions are a brute fact about the universe. And that so far, physics has only accounted for physical to physical interaction, right? Like when, hammers pound nails into wood, right? That's, right? We can describe the force of the hammer hitting the nail, getting driven into the wood. All of that is physical, right? All the way down. And so we might say that in addition to physical forces, there are non-physical forces, and they're just a brute fact about reality. There's physical force, and there's non-physical force. So that's another way to address this issue of interaction. You could just say, how does mind interact with body? Right? How does soul interact with body? Simply by means of this non-physical force, right? It's just a basic fact about reality, right? That's another way to go about doing things. So, what this tells us then is that dualism is not logically inconsistent, right? Again, substance dualism is not logically inconsistent. It faces a number of explanatory challenges that you can accommodate if you're willing to make tweaks in your theory. But just because thermodynamics says dualism is problematic, it doesn't mean you have to dump dualism. So what we're left with at the end of Churchland's piece from neurophilosophy is that dualism faces a number of problems, and perhaps they're insurmountable problems, but they aren't problems that expose logical inconsistencies in dualism. So, moving from the critical end to the more positive approach, or the more positive program that we find in Touching a Nerve. In Touching a Nerve, Churchland wants to develop an idea, or she is developing an idea that's developed elsewhere in her work, right? In her work, also her husband Paul Churchland's work, and work they also collaborate on, which is fun. They're married and they're philosophers. They both like neuroscience. It's just a match made in, I would say heaven, but just brain stuff. So what's the positive project that she wants to develop? Well, the project is that she wants to completely get rid of talk of minds and talk of souls and talk only about brains. So it's not like we're saying that minds turn out to just be brains, or that souls really are just brains. Churchland's goal is to get rid of soul talk entirely, get rid of mind talk entirely, and deal solely with brains. So how does she want to do this? Well, the general argumentative strategy that Churchland offers in this piece and elsewhere is to say that the one thing that a soul theory has going for it is that it can account for things like conscious experience, right? Things like the unity of consciousness or qualia, right? Stuff like that, right? That there's this dimension of our conscious life that's completely experiential, and that's always been the toughest nut to crack, right? For neuroscientifically inclined philosophers, right? Again, Frank Jackson offers his marry the neuroscientist thought experiment. Another guy, David Chalmers, offers the example of philosophical zombies. So if you ever get a chance to look up qualia zombies, you'll figure that, you'll see what that's all about. So consciousness has always been the toughest nut to crack. And so what Churchland does is she wants to point to these areas in which we explain our conscious experience by appeal to what's happening in the brain. And so what we end up with is we say, why are we experiencing this? Because the brain is doing such and such, right? Because this is happening in the brain. And so if that's right, we no longer have to appeal to something like a mind or a soul to account for our experiences, but rather we just point to how brains work. So how do we do this? Well, she offers a few examples in that chapter 2 from Touching a Nerve. So one is the example with Novocaine. So she gives the example of Novocaine where the chemical in Novocaine, procaine, blocks sodium ion channels in our neurons, right? So neurons have these sodium ion channels that enable messages to travel, enable impulses to travel down the neurons to pass massive messages throughout the brain. So what procaine does is it blocks the sodium ion channel and stops the neuron from signaling. And so when the dentist starts poking around in that area that has been exposed to procaine, well, the neurons simply can't fire. And if they can't fire, there's no message passed to various chunks of our brain alerting us to painful sensations, right? So in a sense, those neurons just don't pass the message, and so you don't experience those painful sensations that come along with root canals and the like. So, how do we explain the sensation of numbness? We explain the sensation of numbness in terms of procaine blocking sodium ion channels. So what is there to numbness? Nothing other than procaine blocking sodium ion channels. That's all there is to the story. Another one is how we think about or how we represent the world, right? Our experience of the world. So rats, she notes, have a gigantic somatosensory cortex, right? So they have a huge chunk of their brain devoted to incoming tactile sensations. And the explanation for this is really simple. They learn about the world by means of their whiskers, right? They whisk about the world, and that's how they develop a picture of the world. We, human beings, on the other hand, we have an enormous visual cortex right here in the back of our brains. Why do we have this? Well, because vision is the primary means by which we learn about the world. So how we represent the world, how the world shows up for us, is a product of our of an unusually large visual cortex, right? And how the world is going to show up for a rat is a function of its unusually large somatosensory cortex. So why do you have the visual experiences that you do? Well, because we're evolutionarily designed to rely on vision, and so we correspondingly have a gigantic visual cortex. Finally, she gives us an example with split brain patients, right? So with split brain patients, the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres of the brain, right? That's severed, and so messages can't get passed back and forth. But when you do this, you change the way that people, you change some of people's cognitive abilities. And you change them under really special conditions, but you change them nonetheless, right? So if you ever get a chance, you can see that it's really striking to see examples of this. So if you get a chance, just when you're playing around in YouTube and you've got nothing better to do on a Friday night, because clearly you all have loads of free time, you can Google split brain patients to see how this works, right? In short, what shows up in one visual hemisphere can't be articulated by the agent, but the agent is able to draw a picture of what shows up in that what shows up in that hemisphere. Right? So they can't articulate it, but they can draw a picture of it. It's really weird. So where does this leave us? Well, what we find with Churchland is we find accumulating evidence that to explain why we have the experiences that we have, we just need a better understanding of how the brain works. We don't have any grand theories about how the brain works right now. Neuroscientists typically don't occupy themselves with grand unifying theories of neurofunction. Right? In fact, very recently there's a philosopher of mind. His name is Andy Clark. He's at Edinburgh right now. He came out with a paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences last year called predictive coding. Right? Or the name of it is Whatever Next. That's the name of it, Whatever Next, and it's about predictive coding. And so this is, I think, one of a handful of examples of somebody trying to offer a grand unifying theory of neural functioning. So if you get a chance, you can just Google Whatever Next, or predictive coding in the brain, and Andy's paper should come up. Anyway, so we need better theories of how brains work. And when we get a complete understanding of how brains work, then we'll have a complete understanding of consciousness. And so at that point, we can just get rid of talk of consciousness. So how does this relate to the mind and rationality bit? How mind is embodied and how we're not necessarily rational? Well, it connects to it in a really interesting way. So we reject the disembodied view of mind by saying there's no such thing as mind. On Churchland's view, there are no minds, there are no souls, there are only brains. It's brains all the way down. And so to say that mind is embodied or disembodied is just a disingenuous way of talking, right? I mean, sure, we can talk about soul insofar as we can talk about like soul food or soul music, or we can talk about something having a lot of soul, or a person being soulful, right? Like we can have these colloquial uses of the term soul, as long as we're clear that talking about souls is kind of like talking about Santa, right? It's a nice sort of fiction, but it doesn't really exist. When you want to get down to what really exists in the ultimate catalog of the universe, what really, really exists, you're not going to find souls there, or minds. You are going to find brains, though. So that's how it addresses the disembodied mind bit. But how does it address the rational bit? Well, Churchland doesn't say it specifically, but it's a relatively short jump from her view that it's brains all the way down to a view about rationality. And here's the jump. Rationality is a feature of minds, right? And this is very obvious in Descartes. Not in the bit that we read, unfortunately, in another bit that called Discourse on the Method. So in that, Descartes says that he says what distinguishes animals from people is that people have minds, they are rational, whereas animals don't. People are language users, and language use is a hallmark of rationality. Animals don't have language, at least not human life languages, and so they don't have human life levels of rationality. So as soon as you get rid of mind, you get rid of rationality, right? Because the question then is, what is there to be rational, right? What is the thing that can be rational? The answer is nothing, right? Minds are bearers of rationality. Souls are bearers of rationality. But brains aren't. Brains simply aren't the kinds of things that can be rational or irrational, right? You might say that brains are irrational, right? So a brain is rational in the same way that my phone here is rational, which is to say, it's not. Right? It runs on a number of very interesting principles, right? And it's made up of certain kinds of materials. My brain is made up of neurons, which are in turn made up of sodium and potassium and all sorts of other chemicals. My phone is made up of silicon chips and a little bit of plastic. But neither my brain nor my phone is rational. They're simply not the kinds of things that can be rational. And so we reject the view of human nature as being essentially rational because rationality just isn't a thing on the radar for this kind of view that Churchland endorses. So, when he first started this talk, about 22 minutes ago, give or take, I said that Churchland appeals to neuroscientific evidence for understanding how minds work. Descartes doesn't, right? Descartes appeals to thought experiments. So, an important point I want to highlight is a difference in method. So, it's a question of how do we go about answering philosophical questions about mind? Descartes says that we can do it through thinking, right? Through thought experiments, that we can reflect on our concepts, that we can conduct various thought experiments and understand what it is to have a mind, and what's involved with being a human being. For Churchland, we don't conduct thought experiments. We conduct scientific experiments, right? We don't reflect on our concepts, right? We don't think, well, could I actually think without a body? Churchland wants to know, no, really. Could you do anything we recognize called thinking without a chunk of your brain? And so it's a difference. So the difference in method here is a difference between reliance on thought experiments versus reliance on scientific experiments, right? It's here, in this case, neuroscientific issues, or neuroscientific methodologies. So, the bigger question, the meta question for us is this. When we're thinking about mind and human nature, what evidence counts as relevant or important evidence for thinking about human nature and thinking about minds? Is it thought experiments? Is it reflecting on the contents of our concepts, our ideas about human nature? Or are the sciences ultimately going to give us the final answer?